funny.
Well, hello, I'm Jennifer Jensen from the Bonner County Extension Office. And I am here today to talk about pruning especially, and then we'll also talk about some other fall gardening topics. But we'll start off with pruning. The other topics we'll talk about primarily will depend a little bit on time, but a little bit on planting, some of the things that you will be planting now. And then just a little bit on preparing and thinking about what you're putting in your garden journal and getting ready for next year, because that's one of the things I love about this time of year is preparing and planning and getting excited about my garden next year.
Hope springs eternal.
Yes.
Even if your garden was terrible this year.
Yes. So when it comes to pruning, you want to think about the timing of your pruning. And we're going to talk about pruning in general. There is some pruning that you may be doing now, but a lot of your pruning is going to happen in sometimes in the winter when the plants are dormant. You'll find that with your fruit trees and some of your other fruit shrubs. But then for other plants in the spring is a good time, for instance, for some conifers to be pruned. And for plants that bloom on last year's growth, you would want to prune them, oftentimes maybe in the late spring or whenever it is after they have bloomed. And then during the summertime, you may also have some pruning done depending on when that shrub flowers, and it will also slow the development of branches. So if you are trying to condense the size of your shrub, you may choose to prune in the summertime for that. Yeah.
So question, give me an example of plants that bloom on last year's growth, like something that's fairly common around here. Can you think of anything?
Raspberries, or is that?
Well, so raspberries in some cases, yes. And we'll talk more about those where they have the primicanes and then the floricanes, and so that last year's growth is what they flower on.
Okay.
So that's one example.
Okay.
And I'll just go ahead and mention now, this is a rather old book here. This is the titled How to Prune Almost Anything, and I believe this book is actually from probably the 50s. Oh no, 68. So, but still quite old. But it's still a good resource when you have a plant in your yard and you want to know, well, when should I prune it? How much should I prune it? This one has an A to Z section of the different plants, and you can look it up and see, does it flower on last year's wood or the current season's wood, and know better when and how much to prune off while you're doing that. All right. Some of the pruning that you might do can really be done at any time during the year. So if you have dead branches, anytime during the year you can take those off. If you have suckers coming up from the ground or the water sprouts that come up from the branches, those can be pruned off at any time. If you have other broken branches, you may have included bark is when two branches are growing so close together that their bark actually grows in between the branches. As they get bigger and bigger, it gets enclosed inside of there. And the reason why you would want to prevent that and prune that out is because that tends to be a weak joint within a tree. So you'd want to prune that out. Oftentimes pruning out one of the branches, hopefully early on, so that not that much bark is included, which won't leave as much of a wound in the plant.
Or do they go, like that picture there, do they always kind of go out? You're not talking about a branch that comes off.
Yeah, they're usually going out together. It could be on another branch. Usually you're going to see it more on some of the larger branches. And if you have a multi-stemmed or multi-trunked tree, you may see some of that at the base, or if you have a tree that comes up and then there's 2 or branches. If the spacing is not appropriate, then you may see some included bark there. Yeah. So some of the pruning cuts to think about as you're pruning. The two main pruning cuts would be a thinning cut and a heading cut. So a thinning cut is where you're cutting back to a lateral branch. There's already a lateral branch coming out from this side here, so we're going to prune just beyond that there. That would be a thinning cut. Or a heading cut would be where you're just cutting back somewhere on the branch and leaving a stub that sticks out. In some cases there might be a small bud that's there that is going to grow on. Oftentimes, depending on the species, but when you have the heading cuts, there may be latent buds within the branch here that then start to grow, and you might get a number of shoots growing from there. Let's see. Here's just another example of those two cuts. On here, a thinning cut, we're going either back to another lateral or other branch that's coming out off, or you're going all the way back to the main stem on that, as opposed to leaving these stubs here. If you were to head it back there and just leave those stubs, that would be the difference.
We kind of do something in between, I think.
Yeah, and in some cases, depending on what you're pruning, you might have a combination of both types you're pruning. And again, just some other examples, more of a low-growing shrub where you might have some thinning cuts going back into it. Oftentimes this is going to help let more light into the plant, or you're just going to maybe shear off the top of it like you might do with a hedge, and those would be more heading cuts in that case. So you usually don't want to top your trees because that can lead to a whole bunch of growth coming up at the very top there, and those other branches that then grow from that point may not be as strongly attached, and it may just not look as nice as you might like. This would be more in lines with the pollarding technique of pruning, where some trees are managed with this type of pruning, but it is very intensive because you're cutting back a lot of those growths every year. So in general with trees, we try not to top them. When you don't top them, then you get more of that sort of brooming effect at the end. And then with your conifers, of course, if you top those, you lose the nice conical shape of them. Sometimes when it's under a power line, that can't be helped, but hopefully in your own landscapes as you're planting it, you can then make sure that you're not planting a tall evergreen directly under a power line or something else that might inhibit it. So we'll talk about where to make the cuts. And what you want to do is cut it by the branch collar. And the branch collar is this portion where the branch attaches to the stem. And it's usually, it might be a little bit rippled, that you might see that depending on the plant. But it's this section here. And you want to make your cut just out beyond that. Within the branch collar is the tissue that's going to differentiate and seal over the wound that you've made so that pathogens can't get in there. If you cut too deep into the collar, if you were to make just a straight cut here, you're losing some of that tissue, and you may notice that you don't have the wound seal over in that section. So you wanna make your cuts back, just beyond the collar there, and here's another, example where, now this would be when you have a larger branch, it's a good idea to use 3 cuts to cut it. So we've got our branch collar here. We know we want our final cut to be just out beyond that. But if you were to make your cut right here between C and D and just cut straight down, there's a chance as you're using your pruning saw, you get to about here, the weight of that limb then just drops the whole branch and this portion of the bark gets stripped off. So to avoid that, I've got some colored diagrams. You want to first make this little undercut at A here. You're just gonna, not all the way through, but just enough to kind of clear this bark section on the lower part. And then you're going to make a cut at B where that blue line is. And that's basically going to eliminate the weight of that wood. Now if this starts to strip back on the bark, it's going to hit this little notch you made at A and stop. That bark isn't going to get ripped off all the way down there. And then when you just have a little stub left, then you can go back and make your final cut between C and D there. And this is what I was saying, where you wouldn't want to go straight down along the trunk of the tree there. Here's some images of wounds sealing over. You want to have a wound that completely seals over, and this on a larger wound can take a few years, but if you have maybe it stripped at the bottom, then you might get something like this where it starts to seal over the wound as it should, but this section here, that tissue that differentiates into that seal over the wound, was removed during the cut, and so that portion is not growing. Some other things to think about when you're cutting is if you are cutting back to a bud that is on the plant, you want to make sure that oftentimes we cut on a slant, and that's just going to help prevent rain or irrigation water from just sitting on that cut, which could potentially lead to rot. So you have a slant for that to drain off, but that lower portion of the slant, you need to make sure that's above where that bud is that you wanted it to grow from. If you cut too much down, this whole portion here above where the bottom of the cut is likely just to die. Same with there, that's a little too close on the top and the bottom there. And this one here, there's a good stub that's left above the bud. The bud is probably going to be fine, but you don't need that much left above it. So we talked a little bit about what you could cut at any time, like the dead branches or the water sprouts or suckers. So those are things that you want to prune out. Another good pruning technique is to prune out the crossing branches. So these are going to rub on each other. In some cases they may actually grow together at that point. And usually you don't want the branches to be heading back into the tree itself. So that if it's crossing with these two branches here, this one here that's headed back into the center of the tree, that would be the one you'd remove so that it doesn't rub on those other branches. When you're pruning particularly a fruit tree, but other nursery trees as well, you want to make sure that it gets off to a good start. So if you have your tree that you start with in year 1, and it has a few branches coming off of the main trunk, you usually want to then prune it so that there's good structure. Think about these branches that are on that very small tree. as that tree becomes older, those are going to grow quite big, and you want them to have good structure to then support the rest of the branches on the tree. So in this case, they've selected 2 main ones that they want to save. A year later, those now have produced branches. They still have a main leader coming up, but then they have some other main branches there marked by 3 and 4 above that. And then 6 to 8 years later, you've got this nice structure. These lateral branches are well spaced apart. You should make sure they're on good aspects of the tree, so it's not all heavy on one side. And then you have a nice shaped tree. If you were to save these top ones, A, B, and C, here in the beginning and prune off the others, you get a tree like this, and you start to get side branching off of that. And then 6 to 8 years later, it's more of the broom effect. And in here, where these 3 branches are now growing bigger, you might get some of that included bark and damage in that area.
That looks like our trees.
Anybody else feel guilty for every tree they've ever pruned? No, I'm seeing I did it wrong.
I couldn't bring myself to cut them. Katie is the one that hacked at them.
Yeah.
I didn't want to hurt them.
Especially when the tree is this size, it does take a lot to prune it back to something like this. So I completely understand, but try
We've
to.
never pruned, and our trees are probably anyway 10 years old, and so they were just our semi-dwarf cherry. We couldn't.
Yeah.
So it was,
And there are some cases with fruit trees where you might have a pruning that is more similar to this, but you still want to try to make sure that those lateral branches aren't going straight up, that they are going out a little bit more, and you may still have sort of a vase-shaped structure to your plant, but it's not so tight together. Yeah.
I've seen some where they've put props, like fruit trees, where they'll prop them out.
Yes.
So
Yes.
they'll keep that, but they'll put 2x4s or 1x or something in between them, the branches, to give them that shape.
Exactly. Yes. So that's a good technique. You can take a piece of wood. I've seen it where they'll cut a notch at either end to sort of hold it up against the branch and then put them in place. I know that the manager over at the Sandpoint Organic Ag Center at the orchard there has, he's created little cement cups with a hook on it, and then he'll tie those to branches to weight it down, rather than forcing it out with the wood. He weights it down with little pieces of cement. So, and you know, I'll take this time, if you'd like, there's a good publication from Oregon State University and on training and pruning your home orchard that talks more about how to prune your fruit trees to a good shape. So you can help yourself to those. For pruning conifers then, of course you want the main central leader for most of your conifers. Some of your conifer shrubs, you go pine, you might not, but for the ones that have more of that pyramid shape, you want to maintain that central leader. And if latent buds are present on your branches, you may prune more severely, and usually using a thinning cut unless you're forming a hedge. Another time when you're not using a thinning cut, you're using more of the heading cut, would also be if you're producing Christmas trees, for instance. They'll just shear those.
They'll take those, it's like a 2x4 and the string or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, they do it like this, and then they go, anything outside that string, they go like this. I thought that was a brilliant idea.
Yeah. With your whorled branching conifers, so basically where you have your trunk coming up and there's a whorl of branches coming off of it there, you can make a single flush, they make a single flush of spring growth, and so shearing then in the spring for those Christmas trees can be done. And you might then prune to more of a dormant bud after the new growth is finished there. And you can thin unwanted branches as needed at any time of the year for those. And if for some reason you do get another leader that starts to come up, occasionally you may find that one of the upper branches becomes a leader, then you can prune that back as well, so you maintain that central leader. With hazard trees are basically any tree that may have some sort of structural damage or death or disease in it, and then there's a target below it. So in this case, if people are walking under the tree, or there's a home or other building nearby, then this would be considered a hazard tree and should be pruned to maintain that. If it's out in the woods, you may, it's not as much of a hazard tree if you're not around it at all, so it's not as important to prune it. But where you have dead limbs or disease in your trees near a home, or where people are walking, or where you park your car, you'd want to take care of those.
So you would just prune out the dead stuff?
For something like that, primarily pruning out the dead stuff, unless you find that it is a disease or insect that may be moving into the rest of the tree. Yeah. And some trees, some trees tend to be a little bit more brittle and will have more likely to have branches fall. Silver maples are one of them. They grow very fast, and so they're nice as a shade tree in that aspect, but they also can drop limbs pretty easily. Usually, maybe not the extremely large limbs, but still good sized ones. So if you have a hedge that you'd like to prune, you may prune it more as an informal hedge, as they've done here with this potentilla, where you're still basically maintaining the shape of the plant, but you're going to be using more of those heading cuts to maintain that shape, rather than going in with your shears and just shearing a straight line with it. On the other hand, with your formal hedges, especially if you're doing something like topiary, you would want to use those shears, and you're basically making a lot of heading cuts with those. And depending on the plant, this might be to maintain a hedge like this. You may be doing that several times through the growing season. And I'll talk about this, but you do need to go in occasionally and still make some of those heading cuts in a formal hedge that you shear. When you're making a hedge, you want to make a upside down V shape, and then you can top it to be flat on top if you like, but the bottom should be wider than the top. So what this does is this plant is going to get more sunlight to all of its leaves, and so you're more likely to have leaves all the way to the bottom. If you see some shrubs that have been sheared more into the standard V shape, where it's much narrower at the bottom, you're likely to see that there's not as many leaves down there because it just doesn't get as much sunlight to it. This top portion is blocking it. And then also, when you have certain shrubs, you may want to do renovation pruning, where you're basically pruning it back to the ground and then letting it come back after that. Not all shrubs respond well to a renovation pruning, so check a book or check online with some of the resources
But a lilac does.
to determine that. Yes, a lilac does. A barberry is one that can do that as well. So.
Okay. Guess what we're gonna do?
In some cases, when, for instance, with the rhododendron, What this book recommends is to fertilize and water that plant well for at least a year before you plan to do the renovation pruning, so that you make sure that that root system is nice and strong. And then you can go back and do the renovation pruning. Rhododendrons aren't going to be as quick to respond as something like a lilac or a barberry. Pruning for disease management can happen at any time. Some of the, I just wanted to talk about some of the things mentioned in this article that talks about pruning apple trees. As you're pruning for disease management, obviously if there are diseased parts of the plant, you would want to prune them out. When you are pruning them, you want to make sure that you're cleaning your tools between each cut, so that you're not potentially spreading that disease to other parts of the plant or to other plants that you have. But what you can do is that you can prune for better aeration, so you're opening up that canopy more. That means more air movement is coming through. There's not as much moisture being held right around the leaves, which oftentimes leads to some of the diseases. So you're decreasing the shoot density and increasing the distance between the growing shoots as well, which can be helpful for slowing a disease like scab in apples. And you're affecting how wet those leaves or buds might be, because hopefully with this increased aeration, they're drying out faster, so fire blight or other diseases are less likely to cause disease. And then you also want to remove the inoculum or infected tissue, so if you are finding it, you're removing that off the tree, so it's less likely then to have more inoculum to spread to other parts of the plant. And in some cases, when you're pruning off the diseased, you may not then be following those nice pictures of which branch to prune off, because you might just not have the option. There is the chance that as you are pruning, you're creating wounds, and so that's partly why you want to make sure your clippers are cleaned between each cut, either with alcohol or a bleach solution. And hopefully you're making good cuts that will seal over. You've got a slope to your cuts so that those water won't just sit right on the top of them as well.
So if, I have a picture I was gonna show you. We have something in our apple trees that makes the leaves spotted. It's not, I don't think, a pruning issue. I can't figure out if it's bugs or yuck. And so for pruning though, it's everywhere. So we're talking spray of some sort, I assume.
Yes. Pruning is not going to be effective for all diseases within your trees. If it's within the branch itself, then that might be a good one. But if it's more of a leaf disease, then
I can't tell if it's bugs or a disease. And I took a baggie of leaves to, I did a canning class at the Bonner County Gardeners, whatever, over there, and they couldn't tell me what it was. Doesn't seem to affect the fruit.
It's a little hard to tell from the picture. It almost looks similar to something that's called a blister mite that can be in apples or pears.
There's, if you, I think, go back left or right, there's one more picture of a leaf.
Oh yeah. They'll cause spottings. Those spots will be a little bit raised, like a blister, which I can't quite tell from the photo.
I'll check that,
Yeah. But Yep, if it's strictly a leaf disease or insect, then a spray is probably more appropriate than trying to
We
prune it.
probably need to identify it before we know what kind of spray to use on it, I
Yeah.
assume.
Yeah,
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 okay.
so.
Propane weed burner would probably take care of it, wouldn't it?
Yes, but your tree might not be so happy afterwards. Here's just a photo with some apple blight in this tree that you could try to prune out. When you do have a disease in your branches, you want to make sure that you prune down well beyond where you see the death or damage in it, to try to make sure that you've gone beyond where that infection has occurred. Here's just a little bit more about fire blight. This is from the Pacific Northwest Handbook for Disease Management, talking about removing it and burning it or taking it off your property as soon as you notice it, sterilizing your tools, scouting your orchard every 7 to 10 days. So, and in the fall, this time of year, after harvest, removing any infections that maybe you missed before. This is more powdery mildew, and for powdery mildew, which is more of a leaf disease, if the whole terminal shoot is infected, you can remove that, again, so that there's less inoculum to infect the tree, even more than what it has. And so pruning out and destroying those shoots when the disease is severe, but also following your pruning so that you're getting the good air circulation within the plant as well can help. So I've got just a series of some photos that we'll just kind of go through. A lot of these are, my photos are just around, but it's hard to get a good photo of a fruit tree, I feel like, without seeing all the background. But this is an apple tree. We've got a main leader coming up, and this is something that probably could use some more severe pruning than what we've done so far. This tree is just a couple years old. But if you think back to that picture that we looked at before, probably having both of these coming out at the same spot isn't necessary. Maybe pruning one of those, maybe one of these two here, maybe keeping one of these, but maybe getting rid of those others. And again, making sure that you have good branching all the way around the trunk there.
I love that truck.
Yeah. Here's just another angle of that same plant then. And again, trying to make sure that you have branches on all sides.
Our trees are very heavy on one side because they're kind of up against a hill.
Oh,
And so they get really good sunlight on one side. So should we prune heavier on the sunny side?
You could prune heavier on the sunny side to try to help make sure that some of that sunlight does penetrate through to the other side, so that it is a more well-rounded plant. When you're not ever seeing the other side, it may not be quite as important, but you still don't want all the weight just on one side of the tree. I was gonna skip ahead to another fruit tree and then go back to some of these others. Here's a cherry tree, And this does have a little bit more of the vase shape, so there's not one main leader trunk coming up. We've got more, we've got sort of a main branch coming out that way. This one points a little bit more towards that way. They do all sort of come from the same spot, so it's not quite ideal. And sometimes you don't always get the chance to prune how you want. There had been a branch here coming out and filling out more of this portion of the tree until our dog decided to chew it off. So sometimes you don't get that option. These branches here that are coming straight down may not be ideal, and thinning some of those out can help. And there's just another picture, and you can sort of see that it is sort of flat on this side. This one comes out a little bit that way, but having that other branch coming out there would have been quite nice. And just to note, this time of year, you may want to wrap your trunks either with white paper. This is a white plastic tubing that we put around, particularly on the south side of the tree, on your trees like a cherry or a young apple in particular that have thinner bark to them, so that they're not heating up too much during the winter time and then having that bark split.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna go back to this one then. So here is a barberry, and this one is quite old. I have not done much pruning to this, but I have made a few cuts all the way back to the ground on part of this shrub, and then you can see that there's new growth that has come up from the base there where I've pruned that. The other portions where I've just pruned back part of it, then I'm just getting some lateral growth off the sides of those older canes or branches there. And they lose that nice redness to their stems the older they get, so the barberries can be nice to rejuvenate every so often, and you wouldn't have to even prune everything all at once, but you may select some of the older canes within it to prune back all the way to the ground. There's just an image where these branches have just been headed off at the top here, and then a bunch of side growth has come off of it. When it comes to your caneberries, you usually want to leave some of the main canes there and then prune back. And here we have blueberries. And with your blueberries, again, you want to prune back some of the branches all the way down to the ground. One recommendation from a brochure put together by Dr. Dan Barney, who is now retired but had been with the University of Idaho, he says to have your canes grow about 6 years and then prune some of those 6-year-old canes out, and then every year your oldest canes, you want to prune a few of those out each year.
I just read somewhere where you take 3 old ones and leave 3 new ones.
Yes, that's a good technique. I think I'd say at least 3 new ones, if not a little more. But you do want to make sure that you're constantly pruning out some of that older growth, because that's going to encourage the newer growth. And after a while, you're not going to get as good berry production off those really old stems. And this is just a young berry. When you have blueberry that you've just recently planted, there's probably not much pruning to be done. You can let them grow up. And one thing you can sort of note here, as those buds start to enlarge in the springtime, the larger buds on the branches, those are going to be your flower buds leading to the fruit. The smaller buds that are there are most likely the leaf buds. So if you are going to be pruning, you want to make sure that you're not pruning off all of your flower buds. Now, when you're pruning grapes, you can prune quite hard. So if you can see here, we have a main trunk kind of coming up. This has not been trellised very well, so it's perhaps not the best example. But with a grape, you can probably prune off more than you think you can. Again, you want to leave maybe 3 or 4 canes, depending on how you have it trellised. That may affect that as well. You may just have one trunk coming up, and then the lateral canes, and then some main ones coming off of that. So, but you can prune pretty heavy for your grapes.
How tall is your trellis, sir?
So that fence is about a little over 5 feet. Yeah.
Is the fence not the good trellis, or is it just the way that the?
Well, for now, we've kind of secured it to the fence. We initially started with just a stake in the ground when it was small. They can get a lot of weight to them, so I would not, we do have plans to build a separate trellis out in front of this, where directly in line with where the grape is planted, so that it has that to specifically grow on
Okay,
and
so it
not the
should be
fence.
kept, because we've got some grapes that I gotta build a trellis system for. So it should be kept in the line of it.
Yes,
Great.
most of the times, especially in a vineyard or orchard, you know, they are grown in straight lines, and then they're managed along that trellis there.
I planted them in a straight line.
Good. That's a
Well,
good
we
start.
don't- we don't have a trellis yet.
Yeah.
They
We
lived.
we took and freed our blueberries this year, and boy, they sure like being,
He did T-posts and wire.
Oh, nice.
I got the berries, I know what to do.
Wonderful, wonderful. Here's another fruit tree that is not a great example, more of an example of what not to do, but you can see there are some laterals coming off here. This portion of the tree is pretty bare, there's just not much growth in that area, but this portion could then be thinned out to try to help stimulate
I was
some of
gonna
that.
say, would that force that bare side to?
Yeah. And another, maybe you can see it better in this picture. Well, maybe not exactly, but this branch sort of comes out, but then it's starting to lean back into the tree. So that's not exactly a good scenario. I'd probably prune it here, keep this branch that's heading out that way, but then get rid of the others. And here's just an example of a crossing branch. It's hitting on almost both of these branches here. And again, this is the one that's coming more back into the center of the plant, so I would remove this and keep these, or at least one of these, but maybe get rid of the other. So when it comes to hedges, again, having it more as a reverse V, an upside down V, this this hedge here is maintained a little bit more like a standard V shape, and you can see it is a little bit, there's not as much green growth. This is very early in the spring, so there's not a lot of leaves out to begin with, but The other thing that I mentioned before with your hedges is they can get quite dense if you're just shearing them. You can, on the tops of some of them, I mean, you could probably put a brick and it would just stay up there because there's so many, there's a big thick branch that comes up, it's been sheared so many times, there's just a couple little branches coming off of that. But then there's nothing actually growing down in the middle of the plant because there's no light getting to it. So you can sort of maybe get an idea of that here where there's these big stems, particularly up at the top. And so if you have a hedge that you're maintaining like this, of course the shearing is necessary, but every so often you want to go in with your pruners and prune out some of those thick branches that, you know, they may, below where you shear, they may just have short little branches and then it's a big knobby branch there. And so go ahead, open that up, just cut some holes into it to allow the light to get down into the middle of the plant. Then new branches are going to come up from there and just help keep that plant healthy from within. So with raspberries, speaking of trellising, oftentimes there's some sort of support that's used for raspberries. In this case, with this planting, they have more of a mound set up. So for these different sort of mounds of plants, they have the T-posts coming up and then they're tied off to those. So that's one technique you can use. Here's just some newer plantings that planted more in a straight row for a hedge, or for more of a lateral trellis. This planting here, it is along that fence, but then we will also put wire in along there to help maintain that and keep it upright there. When you're pruning, as we mentioned before, when you're pruning your raspberries, you can go in now and see very clearly which are the floricanes that are spent and done, prune those out. Prune out some of the suckers that are coming up because if it's a happy, healthy plant, it's probably putting up a lot of suckers and you don't necessarily want all of those. So pruning some of those out, and then you may head your the canes that you're saving, the floricanes for next year, you may head them back if they're extremely long.
So I'm taking out, so this is the second year the raspberries have been in.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm taking out the canes that look dead, that are darker wood,
Yes.
and leaving the newer stuff that was done this year.
Yes.
Okay.
You can probably, what I've noticed on the plants I have and around our extension office garden, the primicanes are still, the leaves even are still pretty green. The floricanes are starting to turn more yellow. And you can usually see where the flower buds have been on those floricanes. Pretty easy.
Okay, so it's the floricanes that I'm taking out.
Right. Anything that had berries on it this year,
Right.
you're going to cut out.
So what about, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of raspberries, and part of them are just fruit, well, they fruited early, and now they're fruiting again. So I've been topping them in the fall after it freezes and stuff, and they seem to be okay, but is that the best way to handle, they bear twice.
They bear twice, and after they bear twice, do they, do those canes then,
They will come back and bear on where the late ones are, I believe, come back next year and bear again.
okay,
So I've just been topping them so that, because they're,
Right.
I've just been topping them at about 6 feet.
I'd have to look that up to double check, because that may be more of a, yeah. I'll have to look into that. just to be
they
sure.
seem to be okay. I mean, we get, like I said, early fruit and then they just stop and the
Mhm.
new growth gets flowers.
Gets flowers. Huh. Do you remember what variety they are?
That's what I'd like to know.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some, there are some that are more fall blooming, but yours sound more like ever blooming. Raspberries. Now, according to this, it does say treat ever-bearing strains of brambles. Let's see, the same way as, in early spring, cut back side canes and head them back to 36 inches.
Oh, okay. In the spring, okay.
Yeah.
That makes kind of sense. Yeah.
In summer, remove spent canes and excess shoots. Well, this says wait to remove bearing canes until late frost. I'd have to look into that
Well,
more.
it sounds like
Yeah.
we're doing, it sounds, from what that says, it sounds like we're doing it right.
Right.
I don't cut them quite that low, but.
Here's a rhododendron, a large rhododendron. It actually was recently transplanted to this location. It had been growing right up next to a house, and so it's a very thin plant because it was either right up next to the house or there was snow shedding off the home. But wanted to show some of these other rhododendrons where they've been pruned but just left the stubs. In general, you wouldn't want to do that. It's best to cut them all the way back down to another lateral branch or to where they come off of the main trunk. Here's an example of more of a branch. I think they started to prune it and then it did come down and pull that bark away there. And again, you want to avoid even little stubs like that. That's about 4 inches long or so, maybe 3 inches long on the plant. If you're going to make a cut there, go ahead and prune all the way back to where the branch comes off. Just another picture there. So, any questions about pruning? Any other questions, I guess I should say.
I'll go home and hack my lilac.
Yeah, and again, you don't necessarily have to prune your lilac all the way to the ground, depending on how it is, but that is one of the plants where you can go in and take some of those older stems out and let some of the newer ones come
This is a really, really, really old bush we dug up from an old homestead place,
Oh.
and then our trees grew up and it stopped blooming. And last year it got its first blooms because we logged and cleaned it out and gave it some more light.
in. Yeah.
But now only half of it's alive. What bloomed last year, the whole side of it just died.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, well, certainly cut that portion out. Are you noticing any new growth from the base?
there's a
or-
lot of little sketchy, there's a whole patch, probably about 8 foot in diameter.
Yeah, too
of-
many suckers coming out.
So I'm
yeah.
thinking probably need to take some of those out
Yeah,
because they're feeding off that main
I
plant.
think you would take some of those out, and depending on how many old branches are left, you may still just prune out a couple of those and leave some, and then as those suckers start to grow up, then go in and prune some of those out. So I wanted to quickly talk a little bit about garlic, because now is the time to plant garlic. And so
Yeah, Katie and I went to the garlic tasting at Snow Valley.
oh,
The
nice.
other
There's a
day.
garlic farm up north of town, and
Yeah,
I had bulbs get 500 of my garlic bulbs 2 years ago.
Oh no. That's
15 years worth of work.
really disappointing.
So I'm starting over.
Yeah. Obviously voles can be a problem. There's another, so you can help yourself to this brochure if you'd like. It gives just some general information about planting, having, you know, the plants themselves can be spaced about 3 to 6 inches apart. And I meant to bring a bulb with me and I completely forgot, but you probably already know, but when you have a bulb, you want to pull off the cloves. It's a good idea to do that off, maybe pull those off a day or so before you're going to plant, so they have time to sort of seal and dry. If there are any wounds that occur as you're breaking them off before planting them. And then planting those 3 to 6 inches apart and about 3 inches deep or so.
The top of the bulb being 3 inches.
Yeah, yeah.
What about soil prep for that? I mean, my garlic, we did it in raised beds the last 2 years and it was nice, organic, rich soil and it didn't like it. And we also overwatered it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a well-drained soil will definitely help. So it may have, with the overwatering, and if it was heavy in organic matter, if it was more of a potting soil, then that's going to hold more water. So
I'm gonna
adding,
go straight into the ground now.
yeah,
Probably with a little aged manure maybe.
you could do that. They don't need too much nitrogen.
Okay.
So depending on how your soil is currently, you may not even
Okay.
need to worry too much about it, but you could probably add a little bit
Okay.
to it as well. They like a pH of 6 to 7, so just slightly acidic. And otherwise they'll appreciate a little bit more of a loose soil.
They don't like weeds.
No, yeah. It's
Weeds and wet feet.
weeds and wet feet, that is good, yes, they don't like that. So mulching can be helpful. Mulching, what I have read in some publications, they'll suggest mulching now after you plant, partly to keep down the weeds, partly to help insulate that soil, so it's not getting too cold too quickly and possibly causing frost damage. They will probably start putting on a little bit of growth now, but you won't see that, it'll just be underground. But you don't want that growth to be damaged. And then what I know, some recommendations are to then remove, especially if it's like a straw mulch, remove that in the spring to help that soil warm up a little bit quicker, because as it insulates with the cold, it also insulates with the heat. But then putting the mulch back on to help with the weed control.
Just put it on, rake it off, put it back.
Yeah, it's a little more labor intensive. You could probably just leave it on, depending on maybe what your elevation is.
I pull it off and run through with a loop hoe and it takes like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
What about watering wise?
Watering wise, so you do want to watering them while they're growing and while they're creating the bulb. So
But not often.
No, but like from mid-May to late June or so, that's when you do want to make sure, you don't want them to be too wet, but again, depending on your soil, you do want to make sure that they have the water, but they're not soggy or, give it time to dry out between waterings, but then once it does dry out, water
The
again.
year I did the best is when I just ignored it and just ignored them.
That's what the garlic lady said.
Yeah, just,
Yeah,
They don't water at all.
yeah,
yeah. And they've got similar, they've gotta have similar soil to mine.
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, and if you think about it, well, especially this year, but oftentimes May and at least early June, we're getting a fair amount of
Yeah.
precipitation
Yeah.
still, so that can cover it. But then you want to taper off that watering later into June and then completely stop watering about the end of June or so, to give them time to dry out.
That's
Yeah.
probably the mistake that I made. I was watering it like once a week in a raised bed that had,
Oh, other,
that was plenty damp.
yeah,
I'm sure I just
Yeah.
overlived it.
yeah,
We watered ours probably pretty close to through July.
did you?
Seemed to be okay.
Yeah.
But I didn't,
Like
I didn't dig it until the middle of August.
I was gonna say, if you were digging
I
in July,
didn't,
yeah,
no,
so, yeah,
because I wait till 2/3 of the leaves are dead,
right,
and then I pull them,
yeah.
and that, it's usually the middle of August for us.
A couple other notes about the garlic. One, disease that we've seen, just a little bit here in Bonner County, and they've also seen it at some places up in Boundary County, is white rot disease. And it's a disease that affects garlic, but really any alliums. And I didn't put this in a slide, but we have this brochure that was put together through the University of Idaho. And there's some good pictures here. Some of the identification features that you might see during the growing season would be chlorotic symptoms above ground, you know, when those leaves aren't dying back. But as you're planting your garlic now, be especially aware of any cloves that you might have that are have a whiteness on them, but also these black little dots, almost like very small poppy seed dots on them, along with that white rot.
What causes it?
It's a fungal disease, and it's something that it's common more so in the eastern U.S. area. It's one of the reasons they have the allium quarantine down in southern Idaho, is to keep this disease out, because there's so much.
Is this the one that if you get it, you can't plant alliums there again?
For many years, yes.
That's what I thought we had. We had something that took me a really long time to figure out what it was, and that's waxy breakdown.
Oh, okay.
From the heat a couple of years ago, it was so hot, and they came out looking roasted.
Oh, interesting.
And I thought, oh, I killed my garlic, I killed my soil, I'm never gonna be able to plant again, and it took a long time to figure out what it was. It's hard to find.
Yeah,
But it was just the extreme temperatures.
okay.
So, and I planted some of those, and they grew,
Good. Well, that's good.
and they tasted.
And they were fine,
and you
yeah.
eat 'em. They were just kind of translucent and
Mhm.
waxy looking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
My garlic looked like that. Like the
Like-
picture you have in the top picture?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that was in the raised bed, and I had, it was green growth, but then I had stalks that were bleached out, and they didn't get very big, they were very small.
See, I have a few like that, but I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was me or if it's something else, it's
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
me.
It may have been too wet, and some of that may have just been caused by other rot, of the bulb, if it
It
was
kinda, yeah, that's
too
sort of,
wet.
Well, your houseplants turn yellow if you water them too much.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, so, but this would be more of an identifying feature for the white
they didn't
rot.
look that, like, that, they just looked incredibly puny and,
Yeah,
Hmm.
so, yeah, it was probably just too much water. This, yeah, is very hard to control once you have it, and so the best thing is to not get it. And so, especially if you're saving your own bulbs to plant again, if you were to ever see something like this, you certainly wouldn't want to plant it. So, just something to be on the
Is white
lookout.
rot, is that why it's recommended to not plant, onion sets? Is that the same kind of thing? I've heard that onion sets will carry some kind of a crud that you can't get rid of, and so I've heard you should start your onions from seed. And
Yeah,
not sets.
so it could potentially come in on sets. There is the potential for that.
Yeah.
There may be some other diseases that could come along with it, but that is, is something to think about.
Hmm.
When you're purchasing seed garlic, there are places down in southern Idaho that are inspected each year. Their field soils are inspected to see if they have this disease in the soil. And then if they are cleared, then that garlic can then be sold. And that's the only garlic that they can plant down in the southern Idaho area. But you could also order from some of those places here. Otherwise, you'll notice when you're ordering even ornamental alliums out of catalogs, even though we're not technically within the quarantine district for this, many companies just have a blanket statement, they won't ship to
Yeah,
Idaho.
I found one in Omak, a garlic farm in Omak last year when I lost all mine, that separates it out by county.
Oh, good.
So they would ship to Bonner, but they wouldn't ship to Twin Falls.
Yeah, good. So the other plants that you may be planting in your garden right now would be a cover crop. And so I thought I'd just run through some general principles of cover crops, and then we can talk about some more.
He's laughing because ours is the stall right now.
Well, yeah, the cover crop that I planted was gonna till in early summer. It got so dry, it wasn't,
Right.
we don't sprinkle water, we just use drip, and so we got this field of cover crop that is now
See,
weed seed.
Yeah. You're
Buckwheat
reseeding your
seed.
cover crop.
buckwheat seed going crazy.
Ah, yes. Well, so we'll talk a little bit about managing your cover crop, and there are some other options that you can use besides just tilling it in. But in general, for a home garden, they can be an inexpensive way to help build up that soil structure, incorporate more organic matter to it, help build up the nutrients in the soil, particularly if you're using a legume. Maybe reduce soil compaction or prevent erosion. And if you've got a heavy textured soil, it can help loosen that as well. And then suppress weeds as well. So with just a few seeds, for instance, of the legumes, they convert nitrogen from nitrogen gas that's in the air into a nitrogen that the plants can use, and they don't do it themselves. They actually work with a rhizobium bacteria to do that. When you have a fibrous rooted crop like cereals or other grasses, they can help scavenge for other nutrients that may be left over in the soil from what you were fertilizing with this season. And rather than particularly the nitrogen that might get leached down through the soil, they'll grab onto that, use it now, hold it in their roots, and then when you till that in the springtime, it breaks down and is available next year. Those fibrous roots can also help control erosion, help hold on to the soil. And they may outcompete the weeds for the water and nutrients. Some in particular can do that better than others based on either the shape of their plant, or some may have allelopathic properties to them. That shading of the plants can help alter the temperature at the soil level and alter the light again that might inhibit some of the weed seeds from growing. And they may provide root exudates, which are just chemicals that come out from those allelopathic chemicals that I mentioned, creating almost a natural herbicide effect. For the erosion protection, when you have a cover crop on your soil, as that rain comes down, rather than just hitting the soil and even a small raindrop can disperse soil particles quite a distance. So by having the tops of the plants slow down those raindrops before they hit the soil, that's beneficial. And then of course those roots are help holding the soil in place. Here's just those raindrops coming down. The soil has the ability to hold more moisture because of more pore structure in it. And then those roots are stabilizing the soil. As far as adding organic matter, when you put that cover crop back into the soil, you can improve soil structure and promote good aggregation of the soil. It can help with water holding capacity and increase cation exchange, or the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients. That should say expect efficient long-term storage of some of those nutrients in there. The plant materials that are more succulent or rich, or they're more rich in proteins and sugars, they might be considered the greens of the plant there. They're going to decompose pretty quickly and add that organic matter more quickly to the soil. They'll release nitrogen as well as some potassium and phosphorus, and release nutrients rapidly but leave behind little long-term organic matter. It breaks down quite quickly. If you've got a cover crop that does have a woodier stem to it, something more fibrous, that's going to take longer to decompose. It'll still be decomposing after these are finished. So it's a slower release of nutrients. And in some cases it's higher in carbon, and so it may actually tie up some of those nutrients as the microbes are breaking it down in the soil. But it can help promote more stable organic matter, leading to better soil physical properties there. And then some folks will refer to tightening the nitrogen loop with cover crops. So we talked about how some of the cover crops, they can help grab onto any excess nutrients that are in the soil right now and hold on to them. And then we also have the legumes that, in association with the bacteria, are then using the atmospheric nitrogen and turning that into nitrogen that's available for plants, and then that gets cycled back into the soil and the plants growing there. So you can till, you don't always have to till your soil or till in the cover crop, but it is going to help speed up that decomposition process. You have more surface area that's exposed to oxygen. The soil may actually be warmed up by cutting down that crop and tilling it in and having more soil exposed to the sun. And of course you just have smaller pieces that have to break down. For the maximum long-term soil benefits though, you don't necessarily want to till too much in your soil, because that can break down some of the structure and not be as healthy for the other beneficial organisms in the soil. So finding a good balance of tilling in your cover crops is good.
Yeah, we're starting to pay the price for 40 years of tilling with a Troy-built tiller, and well,
Hard
probably
pan.
30 years since we had anybody plow it.
Yeah, we used to get it plowed every couple of years. That helped a lot, but
And
I
now
noticed.
I just dig in potatoes, and the potatoes just didn't do well because the hard pan.
Right.
You know, the clay from the Missoula flood and stuff.
Yeah.
But nobody's got a plow anymore. Just
No.
like you can't find cow manure anymore.
It's, yeah, it's getting more difficult. Yeah, well, and some folks are getting more into no-till, and depending on how deep that hard pan is, there are some of the cover crops that at least the idea is that you have these roots that can go down and hopefully break through some of that hard pan. And then as they decompose, they just leave holes in the soil then, so it's more of a natural way to break down through that.
So what would have roots like that?
Well, so something like a daikon radish is one of them.
Really?
Mhm.
Gypsum powder.
And I've read some studies where they've been very effective, and then, but have also seen in some gardens where they just didn't grow that much either. But that's one of them that can help break that up. Yeah. So as you're selecting what cover crop to use, you want to think about what your problems are. So if you've got a hard pan, that might be one of your main problems and what you want to gear your cover crop usage for. But you likely have multiple issues going on, whether it's the hard pan, plus you want to provide more nitrogen or just increase your organic matter to the soil. So usually there's not one single cover crop species that you might use. It's a good idea to try to use a blend.
We've been using Austrian field peas, buckwheat, and annual rye.
Mm-hmm. That's a good mix, yeah. Think about when you're going to use your cover crop, if it's maybe just part of your garden or the whole garden, and when you're going to use it. Will it be a fall and winter cover crop, or do you have an area you want to leave where you're not growing in for the growing season during the summer, and maybe plant a cover crop there? You usually want to plant as soon as you can before a hard frost, so maybe 6 weeks. Maybe some of the winter cereals can be planted a little bit later. And you know, even now, I mean, we're getting close. You may have already had a frost. I've been pretty fortunate out in the Hope area to not have a frost yet, but it's going to be coming, and that hard frost is going to be coming soon. So the sooner you can get it in, the better. And if you have an area maybe where you've got tomatoes or other crops that you want to leave in as late as possible, you might try a variety that's more shade tolerant and actually seed underneath those tomatoes. And then you can just cut back the tops of the plants and let that cover crop grow. So as I mentioned, there may not be one particular species. You may have a mix of 2 or more species that you'll mix together to get the best effect for your garden. So there's oftentimes mixes that are available either from the local stores or that you could order through a catalog. Peas and oats is a common mix that you might see. Depending on the peas, they're maybe winter killed in the northern areas, and so mowing and tilling may not be necessary, because if they're killed out through the winter, then they'll just break down on their own. The fall green manure mixes might have the winter rye, the field peas or Austrian peas, ryegrass, clover, in some cases hairy vetch. You do want to make sure that you're aware of the reseeding potential of your cover crops, like the buckwheat is one that will reseed. And so just keep that in mind. Hairy vetch is another one that can reseed pretty well. So
That's not the invasive weedy vetch, it's a different.
it's a different one.
Okay.
Although it can be troublesome, but there are some other vetches as well. Yeah. A spring manure mix might again have the field peas, oats, maybe the hairy vetch in it, and there's a number of places you can go to find those. And here's just a little bit of a breakdown of some of the different species. So the annual rye at the top there, it's not very tolerant to shade, so that wouldn't be one to plant under existing plants. It likes to be planted about 40 days before frost. It will overwinter, and there is a high reseeding chance with that. The Austrian winter peas are semi-tolerant to shade, so those might be planted under something. Planting in September or October is good, and they are hardy to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So depending on where you are in the county, you might, or what winter, that might actually overwinter a little bit. And they generally don't reseed as much. The buckwheat here, not tolerant to shade. It's frost intolerant, so you want to try to get that growing about 12 weeks before the first frost, but very high reseeding potential there. Some others that you might plant this time of year, of course, the winter wheat, a little bit tolerant to shade. Planting dates between August and October. It does overwinter, and so and it could reseed. So the ones that overwinter, it's not going to be killed off by the winter, so you will think about how you're going to incorporate that back into the ground in the springtime. It may be something that you just you mow over, maybe you put a weed fabric over it, plant into that, and kill it that way if you didn't want to go through the tilling process with those. Or you might consider some of the other crops that will be killed off by a winter frost. You won't have that early spring growth to them, but that might be appropriate for what you want to use. And then just a couple others that I wanted to mention here. The mustard is one that is a particularly, it's more of a summer cover crop, but it is particularly good at weed control. Semi-shade tolerant, but you can see that it'll be killed off in the winter.
Well, it grows wild in my garden. I'm gonna let it, I've got some beautiful red mustard that doesn't get buggy like the green. And so I just let it go, and in the spring I've got, so
Yes.
I didn't think about it actually helping with cover crop.
We, several years ago now, up at the community garden in Bonners Ferry, we had a small trial plot of different summer cover crops. And for the mustard, we had a donation of many, many packets of a red mustard. So it was meant to be grown more as an edible, pretty plant, but we used it as a cover crop, and of all the ones we trialed, it was probably the best one for us.
Well, that says something for me, not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have those happy accidents in the garden. The other one that I've used a few times is sunflowers. Again, that's going to be more of a summer cover crop. Doesn't tolerate the frost. It is, you're going to get a lot more of that brown, heavy material that's slower to break down. But if you have more of a dense soil and you're trying to add a little bit more porosity, having some of those larger pieces in it are helpful. Tilling it, if you have a strong tiller, that can be good. When I've used it in smaller sections, this is rather labor intensive, but I've gone in just with my pruners and cut it down into about 4 to 6 inch sections and just laid it on the ground and let it work in itself over the winter and the next spring, because you'll find that over the winter it does not all break down and continues the next year. Here's just another example. This is a book which I didn't bring with us, but the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Extension Service has a very good book on cover crops that this came out of, and the NRCS office also, this is a chart they have of various cover crops. Warm season cover crops on the one side, cool season on the other. finding the right seeding rate. You could use a seed spreader, but you can also just seed by hand, which I'm just, in a smaller garden, that can be quite easy there. So, and then just raking it in to get that good soil to seed coverage.
That's what we haven't been doing, we've been sprinkling it in. That's maybe why it doesn't come up as good.
So very quickly to end this, think about next year. That's one thing about gardeners. I think we're always hopeful for next year. If it didn't work out this year, there's always next year. So maintaining that garden journal to help write down and remember what worked this year, what didn't. Sometimes it's just the weather. Maybe it was particular pests or other problems in your garden. Another thing, more on the landscaping end of thing, think about if there were holes in the garden that you want to add something more to in the coming season. And fall time, sometimes we don't always think about our fall flowering plants, but I know in my garden in particular, I feel like I could add some of those to help make the garden look better this time of year. And that is what I have, and thank you very much for having me.